Hi. I want to talk some more about Buddhism today. I want to talk in particular, though, I've been teaching for a long time. So, one thing that I do know about is common perceptions, perhaps misperceptions about Buddhism that I see in a lot of just ordinary people who kind of walk into the classroom at the big state university where I teach. So that's what I want to get at. I want to get at two things. One is mistaken assumptions about the question is this: people will often say things about Buddhism, like Buddhism says that nothing is real, or questions reality, or everything is an illusion. And these are common kinds of ideas. I mean, we don't need Buddhism for someone to suggest to us that everything's an illusion, or that we all live in a dream, or that maybe we don't know anything. I mean, these are fairly popular ideas, for better or for worse, and they can come from any number of different traditions. The Buddhist tradition, by the way, is also a large and wide one. It's part of the Indian classical tradition. It's even a larger one with all kinds of philosophical positions. So I think that a good thing to do is to not take ourselves too seriously, but if I say something that is useful to you, take it, and otherwise leave it alone. But what I want to talk about today is what generally speaking, in very general terms, what Buddhism does say and what it does not say on this question about sort of what is reality, or is everything an illusion, and that kind of thing. So let me get to that. Okay, here we go. Right, so yeah, this is the question. Do Buddhists say that nothing is real? And what exactly is the sense of the concept of illusion that we get in the Buddha Dharma? When I say Buddha Dharma, I just mean the Four Noble Truths, the basic teaching of the Buddha. And so that is something that I'm claiming, though. I'm claiming things that I'm talking about in this video today are content and ideas that are there in the Buddha Dharma. So again, I'm going to start off by talking about, I think, mistakes that people make when they say that Buddhists think that somehow it makes sense to say that nothing is real, and then go a little bit further into senses in which Buddhists do warn us about mistakes that we might be making and misperceptions that we might have. Both of those things are definitely present. So, okay, and I'll go slow. Sorry for all the words. I don't, sometimes you can do it and sometimes you can't. I want to talk about then what we mean by illusion, skepticism, nothing is real in the sort of European tradition. I'm going to help myself here to European and Western, the European tradition, the Western tradition. Really, of course, at this point in the year 2021, I'm just addressing anybody who hasn't had any kind of real exposure to Buddhism, either in their personal life or in their intellectual or reading life. That's all. It's not really about where anybody comes from anymore. But in any event, so let me just talk for just a slide here about what it is that people who have a sort of Western education or have been acculturated into Western philosophical ideas are going to think about illusion and sort of where that comes from. Of course, obviously that comes from Descartes and Descartes' meditations from the 17th century. Descartes was thinking about basic standards of knowledge, or basic definitions of knowledge. We think of Descartes as historic because Descartes was assuming that it was he, Descartes, a rational person, who had to figure these things out for himself. What he actually found out wasn't, what he actually thought that he found out wasn't really any thing particularly modern. But as a mathematician, Descartes thought that, well, you know something when you have shown that it is logically necessary. And of course, that's, as David Hume noticed, that's very, very strict, almost impossible definition of knowledge. So it wasn't surprising then that it turned out, when Descartes thought about these things as he relates in his meditation, it turned out that he thought he really could only be said to know nothing at all. And so, really with Descartes, this whole idea, we'll talk about this more in the next slide as well, that you have sort of there's your soul, it's only sort of attached to your body somehow, it's not really your body. So obviously that's going to set up the framework for a certain kind of a claim of illusion, that is to say skepticism. And I would say that Buddhist teaching doesn't really sustain skepticism. But right now, I'm just pointing out that one of the things that people in the Western tradition mean when they say that nothing is real or everything's an illusion or we don't know anything are reasons like Descartes thought that he had for skepticism, including the problem of the senses. And another big actor here is Kant, excellent philosopher, very important. And Kant, reacting to Hume, really saw the scientific world, the world of empiricism that says that knowledge is based on experience. Kant saw that world as a kind of barren world, one that didn't have, for example, any values in it, any aesthetics, in particular, any God or freedom, morality. So Kant, though, saw also that there was a very simple psychology there. And he started to ask, well, what has to be true for there to be a mind having these experiences? Well, Kant's answer to that was fairly radical, just quickly. I mean, he thought that there was a conceptual structure that had to be in place in order for experience to be possible. But the things that he included in this conceptual structure, the mind kind of imposed on the input of the senses, what he called the manifold, included things, I think people forget this, things like space and time, causal relations, the multiplicity of objects. So according to Kant, then, just on a very, very deep level, the world as we experience it is a representation. I think that the representational tendency that continues to this day in some quarters in psychology and philosophy of mind is really as much or more due to Kant as to Descartes, really. The last bullet point on the slide there. So transcendental idealism, the idea that ultimately everything is mental, what characterizes both people like Berkeley and Kant in the 18th century, and then the whole German tradition in the 19th century, and phenomenology, in the sense that, so there's the sense then here that somehow, since one simple way of putting it is you could say that since every subjective experience is different, then I guess you could claim that nobody actually knows the truth, capital T, capital T, or something like that. And the more esoteric possibility that everything's an illusion, as in the global skepticism, when the Cartesian says, you can't prove that the external world exists, or you can't prove that you have a body. In general, philosophical skepticism is any skepticism that says that we don't know something that we're absolutely certain that we do know. All right, so again, getting a sense for what we learn to think of as illusion when we're coming out of this sort of Cartesian and Kantian background, where we're thinking that the mind is something really very distinct from the body, so we're sort of looking out onto the world, but we're sort of disembodied ultimately. And this Kantian idea that we're projecting everything, we're projecting triangles and circles onto the world. They're not really there, whatever that's supposed to mean. I do believe that good old-fashioned mind-body dualism, Descartes had some reasons for thinking. He thought that it was certain that there was something that was thinking, namely himself, but he wasn't certain about any of the contents of those thoughts. And so that he was thinking was indubitable, so it had a property that was different from all of the experiences. So it was something different from the experiences. There was mental substance and physical substance, or material substance, extended substance. And these were two different kinds of things, two different categories of being. So as I say, Descartes is historic in his independence and his secularism. He is not particularly groundbreaking in his conclusions. One of his conclusions here is mind-body dualism, metaphysical dualism of the mind and the body. And that, although a lot of people today would say, well, of course, I'm not any kind of dualist. I'm some kind of naturalist. I don't think that the mind is an immaterial soul. Don't be silly. But I think it's really actually not all that hard to point out examples. I think free will and determinism is an example, for example, like a lot of the arguments there, of people who are clearly, definitely in the grip of some kind of mind-body dualism, and that's definitely what's motivating some of their philosophical concerns. Second bullet point, though, today when you say Cartesian, Descartes says in his Optics, he says, I don't mean to suggest there's actually little pictures in the mind. So Descartes actually was more sophisticated, perhaps, himself on these issues than than we might think. But in general, when you say Cartesian today, that means a representational theory of mind. For example, any information processing model of nervous system function is going to be an example of a representational theory of mind. That is, if you say that representations, content, are ineliminable parts of the sort of ultimate description and explanation of the workings of the mind, then you have a representational theory of mind. And note a very important point, that it's precisely that representational model of the mind, subject and the object outside of the subject's head, the mental representation inside of the subject's head, the inner and the outer. That's what's meant by Cartesian. And that setup, that way of looking at things has, to use the cliche that people use today, it has skepticism baked into it. It's baked into it. I mean, once you believe that what you're really experiencing is some sort of internal representation, then there is inevitably, as I say, baked in this question mark about the relationship between that representation and the thing that's causing you to have the representation. So again, this isn't, I don't say this in a real combative spirit or anything like that. I think it's just perfectly natural, speaking as a teacher, that it's just perfectly natural that people are going to bring these kinds of Cartesian notions that come from seeing the mind as disembodied in itself and so on, and project them and say, well, this must be what this Asian philosophy is saying. That's what I say in that first bullet point. And I say there again that these are difficult things to understand. So the second bullet point there, just summing up, these items today that I'm pointing out are often present when people are first encountering Buddhist thinking, or maybe even when a lot of people, I certainly know a lot of people in my classes, before they're really confronting it, before they're really reading and studying it, but they have a popular picture of what it is that it involves. For example, mysticism. I'm often told that Buddhism, philosophy students will tell me, well, Buddhism is a kind of mysticism, because that's what they think. I mean, that's the stereotype about it. It's not mystic, actually. But in any event, Western misreadings of Buddhism will include just the ones I've been talking about, that experience is not real somehow. Therefore, that everything somehow is insignificant. I guess that's Stoicism. It's a kind of Stoicism, skepticism, Puranic maybe. That everything is mental. Berkeley, of course, Berkeley's saying, well, gang. I mean, we say Berkeley's an empiricist. Berkeley says, look, gang, you say you've got the inner and the outer, but you also say that knowledge is based on experience, but the only thing you experience is inner or mental thing. So it looks to me like this outer thing you're talking about is some sort of speculative thing that you don't really have any real grounds to talk about in your experience. You're claiming that all of your experiences are the representation, which is mental. So why don't you just say that everything's mental? And then the whole thing goes poof, right? Because this is so, and David Hume would agree and say, when you talk about, well, the real world, the table of it's really real. He says, well, I don't see where you can go beyond experience to make any metaphysical claims like that. So, and then again, Kantianism, which is a very, very deeply internalized idea in the general public. Again, I can tell you as a public university teacher, the idea that the mind is projecting all kinds of things, that the mind is projecting logic and mathematics, the mind is just projecting everything onto the world. There aren't really any circles that in its extreme. And so, as I say, these readings are Cartesian projections. They're actually ideas that are European ideas, Western ideas, coming, as I've been pointing out, from people like early modern philosophers like Descartes and Berkeley and Kant. And so that's what happens. And then, so looking at that, which I think is an important thing to appreciate, and then of course, then that opens up the question is, well, what does Buddhism mean when it has its own rhetoric of illusion, the world of samsara, the emerging self, the self-dependent arising, and so on. So let's take a look. First of all, in reading and studying, coming to grips with Asian philosophy, this is also true of, for example, Taoism and classical Chinese philosophy, as well as with Hinduism and Buddhism and classical Indian philosophy, is that you really just do not have this mind-body duality. It's even in ancient Greek philosophy, oftentimes this is the case. And for post-Cartesian people in the European tradition, it can just be very difficult to conceive of just about anything as something that can't be hung on this bipolarity of the mind and the body, the inner and the outer, the mental and the physical. So oftentimes then the assumption or the reflex, I guess, is that the object of the game that we're playing here is just to assign something to the physical or the mental, right? The naturalists say that, well, the mental is really physical. The rationalists say, well, the physical, is really something built on the mental. So the Cartesian intuitions often are built on this kind of zero-sum thing between the inner and the outer. But the teaching is, first bullet point still, that the world is identical to experience, and experience is identical to the self. World, experience, self, self-experience, world. Then, what people will have a hard time not doing, again, the European reflex is to say this person either, still having said that, whoever is saying this must be either a materialist naturalist or a rationalist dualist, and so one of them is sinking into the other. But that's a basic misunderstanding. Experience sounds, I think, in English anyway, like a kind of psychological word more than a physical word, so maybe that's a little bit of a grammatical problem. But the sense here is that the physical and the psychological, the mental and the material are both going to collapse into something which is experience. That is, it is experience which sort of constitutes what we build up our experience out of. Of course, then the whole point here is that then the phenomenal experience itself, conscious experience itself, isn't going to be part of that world that we're trying to understand. It's something that's constitutive of the world. And I would point this out, I think this is really important. The second bullet point, it's the empiricist tradition, really. I already talked about Berkeley, Hume, James, Wittgenstein. I talk about James other places in the series. Is really more Buddhist. There's a really strong, so there's a Kantian reading of Buddhism, which I for one think is clearly wrong. But there's an empiricist reading of Buddhism, which I think is closer. And I think that what both Berkeley and Hume taken together on phenomenal experience, and Wittgenstein with his rhetoric of solipsism, I think they're both making the point that is essentially the Buddhist position as well, which is that phenomenal experience is constitutive of the world. Furthermore, again, thinking of the difference between Buddhism and other thought, it's constitutive of the self. The self also is its experience. We think of the Cartesian self as having experiences, but the self in this sense is the samsara self, the self of dependent arising, and that self just sort of is the totality of these experiences. If you want to talk about a real self or a real consciousness in the Buddhist tradition, that's going to be a nothingness, an emptiness. Last bullet point, the microcosm, to use Wittgenstein's phrase, that is, no one experiences the common world. So we ask, well, what would we like to really experience the common world? That's an incoherent question, because there isn't anything that it's like to experience the common world, the world that we read about in geology books and history books and physics books. That's not an experienced world. That's an intersubjective world that's built out of information and representations, conventions and things, which is an interesting topic, and I have a couple of reasons to do. That's one of the things I've been thinking about here. But in any event, so the point is that when you came into consciousness, a sort of world came into being. Remember this real, pretty fundamental lack of a distinction between the mind and the body that has to be always borne in mind. And when the sad day comes, when you lose consciousness for the last time, at that point, that universe disappears, because that universe just is you, each person a world. And this sense of the soul as microcosm, each one of us in the middle of our own phenomenal universe that we can explore out from here, is a really important element in sort of sanctity of life ethics of sub-Asian spiritual traditions, that it's actually something, I mean, put it sort of bluntly, to destroy a sentient being is to destroy a universe of experience, a world. Each consciousness is a world. So that's kind of a nice thought. Some more here, Buddhism and phenomenal properties. Let me just do this. Okay. Hello. Sí, soy Brown. Okay. Okay, gracias. Nos vemos bien pronto. Oh, gracias muchísimo. Okay, bye-bye. Okay, sorry about that. Right, so Buddhism and phenomenal properties. So here's a little of the real deal, I think, as far as what Buddhist philosophy might be of interest here. So you have an argument called Mary Didn't Know about Mary, the colorblind color vision scientist. It's called the knowledge argument. It's from an Australian philosopher named Frank Jackson. His article is called What Mary Didn't Know. And in this article, he has the counterfactual of Mary, who is one of the leading experts on color vision, both the physics of light outside the body and the neurophysiology inside the body and optics and so on. But she has also always lived in a black and white environment. And so it's called the knowledge argument, because the argument is, well, Mary has the complete and correct physical description. Let's be specific. The counterfactual is this, that she has the complete and correct. She's at the end of science. She knows everything there is to know about the physics of light outside the body and the perception of light inside the body. She knows the whole story front to back, and she's not missing anything, and she doesn't have anything wrong. It's a counterfactual, okay? Nonetheless, the argument is, since she's always spent all of her life in a black and white environment, therefore there is something that she doesn't know. She doesn't know what it's like to see colors. Well, you don't know what something tastes like until you've tried it, for example. And that is a serious problem for materialism on the face of it, because if to say you're a materialist means anything at all, it must be some kind of, the metaphysical claim must have some epistemological import. Otherwise, it's not any kind of claim at all. And so it looks like the materialist does need to be saying that there's going to be that there is, in fact, some potential entirely naturalistic, non-dualistic way of explaining everything, including phenomenal experience. And Jackson's claim, along with many other people, Thomas Nagel is another one, is that, Chinese room argument of Searle, is that science cannot do this. What's the answer to that? I mean, I think Buddhists, again, have an argument that is similar to an argument that we find in empiricism, and that is that qualitative experience, remember the problem as it's framed in the what Mary didn't know example, the problem seems to be that you have a complete and correct physical science, all the physical science, but you still don't have some information. But notice that the problem there is that the information isn't located in the world. That is, the information about what it's like is what's constitutive of the world for the subject. You see, so there isn't any sort of information there available generally. That is, each person has their own phenomenal experiences. They're not exactly private. I mean, they're not exactly private in the sense that my phenomenal experiences are somehow in the world, but you can't see them. My consciousness is in the world, it's in my head, and you can't see it. See, again, that's the Cartesian mistake that the Buddhist tradition doesn't make. As far as the problem of phenomenal properties taken as a metaphysical problem is concerned, it looks like the Buddhist view would be then that is a pseudo problem. And I think that we do find the textual support for that too, by the way, notably in the writings of Nagarjuna in other Mahayana sutras, notably the Wisdom Sutra, the long one, and then in the Shobogenzo of Dogen, the Zen document from the 12th century of the Common Era, if you're interested. And so remember, the Cartesian skeptic wanted to say that we couldn't prove that the external world exists, but on the empiricist / Buddhist line, my experience just is the external world. I mean, if you want to know what I'm perceiving, I can tell you what I'm perceiving because that is just my experience. The only thing I could possibly mean by the external world is my experience, which is why it doesn't make any sense to pound on the desk and say the desk is real and it's really real. The desk is here and it's really real. That really real part is incoherent on this view because all I can possibly be talking about is my experience. Okay. So now let's talk about some of the things that Buddhism does teach are illusory, and we should be careful about these illusions. And a main one, a concept, a conceptual tool I want to bring in here is mental formations. The idea that we're constantly forming all these mental formations, just ideas that we think are true. So I'll get to that in the second bullet point. The 5 aggregates of self, again, part of the Buddha Dharma. You've got the 4 noble truths, the 12-point wheel of dependent arising, the 5 aggregates of self, the 8-fold path, and a little bit more. And this is basically what we call the Buddha Dharma, the basic teachings of the Buddha. So the 5 aggregates of self, that is, there are 5 parts of reality that come together, sort of an atomistic, and there's a strongly atomistic school of Buddhist metaphysics, actually. We think of the dharmas as kind of atoms. But in any event, there is the self, the aggregate self is a skanda. What is a skanda? Buddha teaches this. The skanda is a heap or a pile, that is a bunch of things that have been aggregated, thrown together. They don't necessarily have to be together. They come to be and they pass away, like a cloud. So now when we talk about Vajrayana, Tibetan Buddhism, we'll talk about Tantra a little bit more, but that first example of mental formation, that you're disgusted by disgusting things, that there's some things you don't want to touch and so on. And that's a classic example of mental formations. It isn't going to kill you. There maybe is some sort of natural history to your disgust, but nonetheless, it's that you're not in control of yourself enough that you cannot act through the disgust and the repulsion or the nausea or whatever it is. And so that's what Tantra really means, is being able to see through those kinds of mental formations, kinds that really can freeze us. Prejudices, Kant actually is excellent on this. It's sort of garbage in, garbage out, as they say. I mean, people do the best they can. They form these theories. They don't have much experience, and sometimes they have very limited experience for making theories. And we just do that all the time. I'm supposed to be mad at them, so I'll act mad. It's something that the existentialists talk about. I'll act the way I think I'm supposed to act. Mental formations, again, part of what mindfulness meditation should help clear away. We see negative thoughts and feelings. We see repetitive thoughts and feelings, and then when we see them clearly enough, we see the way that they're boxing us in this way, as mental formations. Notice that's pretty quotidian. I mean, it's pretty down to earth, right? I mean, by illusion in that sense, the Buddhist teacher means false beliefs and false feelings. I have to get there by 10, stuff like that. It's interesting to kind of come up with examples of mental formation. Almost everything sort of is one. And so, there's a real example of an illusion. Don't be the slave of mental formations. Be mindful and be able to tell when you're acting out of some mental formation that isn't real. There's a play, Noises Off, where the guy's afraid of the tax collector. So everybody who comes up, your revenue, he thinks everybody's a tax collector. Projection is a big part of mental formation. I'm going to talk about projection a little more. So here's another sort of more meaty or substantial issue, which is the notion of oneness versus multiplicity. You've got, and this is something that plays out in ancient Greek philosophy as well. between the Eleatics and Aristotle. Plato is sort of in between. I mean, the question is, you can generate knowledge the way empirical science and Aristotle generate knowledge by looking at divisions, by cutting nature at the joints, by talking about the multiplicity. You've got the one and the many. You can generate knowledge in the many with your basic axiom that each thing is itself and not any other thing. And that's how you're orienting yourself. There's another way of looking at things, which is to try to generate knowledge and produce knowledge by looking at everything as a oneness, by looking at everything as a unity rather than as a whole composed of parts. It's not easy to think exactly about productive knowledge on that sort of holistic way of trying to produce knowledge from awareness of the oneness of everything. But Buddhism does put a big emphasis on this in its metaphysics, that not only that everything's causally connected to everything else in sort of massive butterfly effect, but sort of literally that everything is one thing, that the event that is the universe at this moment is unified in that sense, not just every node causally dependent somehow on the others for its possibility, but actually an identity that the whole thing really is just one thing. Expressed by the Mahayana Buddha coming back down into the realm of samsara, giving up nirvana, giving up Atman until all sentient beings are liberated. So there's another powerful sense in which a Buddhist teacher might say that things are an illusion. They might say that things are an illusion, and that you think there's a multiplicity of things, but in fact, there's really only one thing. Really, you would understand that there's really only one thing. Spinoza seemed to think something like that as well. Nirvana, another one of these words that's terribly misunderstood in its popular usages, literally is a kind of dropping away of the boundary between the self and the rest of the world. I mean, not that I would have experienced that directly, don't take me too seriously. But notice then that is just that idea, that is that holistic idea, nirvana, the realization of oneness, the realization of the unity of the universe, which is the teaching. And that's, again, the sense in which it's an illusion that there are multiple things. That's what Nagarjuna is saying, and Dogen. So own being, as the sort of awkward phrase often is translated, the sense of, I think it's from Katzi's translation of the Diamond Sutra, but in any event, own being is the sense that this thing is independent, that the desk could be sort of floating out in space without anything else there, sort of, that each thing has a boundary and it's distinct and separate from everything else. The very assumption that Aristotle insisted was actually necessary for producing any knowledge at all. But the Mahayana teaching will be that the sense in which nothing is real is this sense that we think everything has an essence in and of itself and is separate from everything else. So of course that goes to the notion of the self as much as it goes to the notion of our sort of notion of what concrete objects are. And the whole story here, the disintegration of the Vedic soul self, because you have this from Vedic times and Brahmanic teachings, you have this very, very conservative hierarchical teaching that everything is where it is by virtue of the movement of the soul on the wheel of karma, which is a glacially slow movement on that ancient teaching, which again, remember, was the teaching that backed up the whole society, the whole caste hierarchical society. So a lot of what we find in this sort of axial age, mid-millennial movements, including Siddhartha Gautama's movement, is an attempt to kind of try to loosen that up and show that the soul can make progress on the Bodhi path in one lifetime. And the natural progression of that, of course, is to disintegrate the soul, the one that's stuck on the wheel of karma, the karmic soul, to disintegrate that all together. I mean, that's sort of the ultimate overturning of Vedic Brahmanism. And in Buddhism, with, for example, the Buddhist teaching of the five aggregates of self, The idea is that the self is this ephemeral aggregate, something that's coming to be and passing away. That self, the material self, is the thing that is not real. It is impermanent. Impermanence is another sense in which things are an illusion. Remember, you think that things are essentially real, and part of that is a sense that somehow they are permanent things. And of course, getting away from the last thing I say on there, getting away from that sense of soul as a permanent thing is not only a way to get liberated from bondage to the wheel of karma, but also is a way to relieve your fear of death. So anyway, just summing things up then quickly, I would say my points are these. First, that a lot of interpretation, or at least popular understanding of Buddhist doctrine, is systematically distorted by Cartesian notions, notably that the soul is distinct from the body, mind-body dualism, skeptical worries that come from mind-body dualism, and the mysticism that follows from skepticism, I would say. So those are all things that will be projected onto Buddhism, but they're really elements coming from this Cartesian tradition, I think. There isn't a problem, a metaphysical problem about consciousness, because there isn't, first of all, again, there isn't just in the first place a conceptual distinction between inner and outer, which, you know, you don't have to justify not having that distinction. It's not necessary. It just doesn't have it. But also there is the idea that phenomenal experience is constitutive of the world and therefore can't be seen as in the world, and therefore does not constitute a metaphysical problem, in as much as it's not part of the phenomenal experience, not part of the furniture of the world. Consciousness is not part of the metaphysical furniture of the world. Phenomenal consciousness just is what we mean by being in a world. Two senses of illusion that Buddhist teaching does warn us about are, first of all, mental formations, when our concepts have sort of taken over and we're starting to project them out onto the world, and the permanence of self, the notion, and our identification, of course, with our concrete ego selves. And finally, this notion of realism versus anti-realism is really incoherent. I think it's as incoherent for Buddhism as it is for empiricism, and for the same kind of reasons. So all right, now, you know, I just put out what I had. I hope it wasn't, you know, I think there is some very, very interesting and important senses in which Buddhism does teach us that a lot of our experience is illusory, but Buddhism is very down to earth. It's really got its feet on the ground. It doesn't involve magic at all. And, you know, it's easy to say stuff like nothing is real, but, or the external world doesn't exist. But it's a little harder to go on and say what exactly that entails, or, you know, or why you think it's significant to say something like that. I think the illusions that Buddhist teachers are most interested in are the illusions that we uncover through our practice of mindfulness and practice the Eightfold Path, and they will come, as they say. Well, anyway, I better stop talking. That's about all I got. All right. Thank you.